The idea of a democratic economic and social order is a fragile idea which could easily collapse. Recently, through circumstances, I flew from Nairobi to Doha.
Okay.
And you fly, for instance, a couple hours over Saudi Arabia. Saudi, for me, normally in my life here, is sort of this little place where there's some oil and a few Bedouins and some women in black gowns, and it's far away and irrelevant and small.
Mm-hmm.
When you fly like that, you suddenly realize Saudi, flying it, is just about as far as flying from Helsinki to Rome. Thus, Europe is actually very small. And in my own consciousness, Europe is enormous.
Mm-hmm.
One of the effects of globalization is, if you wish, the actual physical time and space is becoming more strong. I live in an intellectual space where European history and European culture is enormous. But humanism is fundamentally Eurocentric. It's not the history of the Saudis, it's not the culture of the Saudis. Humanism, for me, most fundamentally, is a departure coming from Kant. For me, humanism is most fundamentally the trust in individual human reason. That in general, every person has the ability to understand economic society and its human condition, and thus to be a citizen and to vote. Thus, for me, humanism is very, very deeply rooted in this concept of the universal ability to understand and to take sensible decision. But the part of the world which actually has shared that belief, and the part of the world that has actually institutionalized that belief, is geographically very, very small. Most of the planet does not share that belief, and most of the planet has not really shared, except peripherally and in strange and complicated ways in that history. Yes, globalization makes it harder to stay inside Europe, mentally, economically, socially, emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't be surprised if they really took the definition of refugee seriously if more than 20 million people could arrive in this country in a week who probably deserve the title of refugee. The sheer amount of political and social violence which occurs on this planet is enormous. If you took it in the political sense, slowly but surely the number of people who would meet a fairly reasonable concept of what a refugee is runs into the millions. And the idea of millions of people arriving with actually, formally, the right to be declared refugee is fairly terrifying. Now, it's now a story of millions of oppressed and poor people who probably deserve the political title of refugee, not that the ones coming here do, but they're there, out there.
Mm-hmm.
Thus you have to ask yourself, is the concept of refugee a tenable concept still? Or do we have to admit that our world is so klein and the rest of the world is so large that if we were to apply the refugee status utterly correctly, we'd be totally overwhelmed easily? So in that sense, globalization, the obvious stories about globalization, about capitalism, about multinationals, about exploitation, about quasi-slave labor, or if you wish, new forms of indentured labor, which we like to romanticize and call zezé, which seems to me a rather silly way to call indentured labor. But there are huge amounts of motion going on right now, wherein the idea of a stable region in Europe, especially northwestern Europe, because often of us we don't really think of Portugal and Greece as quite in Europe. The idea of a stable area which is ours, which is safe, which shares a 300-year history, which is in some way capable of defining and maintaining a significant degree of political and economic equality and democracy, all of those ideas are under threat by the changes in economic and political geography. Mm-hmm. It was never the case that everybody shared that identity. Mm-hmm. The Netherlands, of course, was a society of so-called regent, a society of patriarchal authority. Thus, we do have to realize that when we talk often about European identity, we're talking about the ideas and actions and values, and often the story people told to defend themselves of what was, relatively spoken, the elite. Even in our own zone of Europe, there were always very large minorities, if they weren't the majority, who shared only marginally in that idealized sense of understanding, awareness, and citizenship. Mm-hmm. Democracy, as we understand it, dates from, in Europe, mm-hmm. tends to date from 1848.
Yes, generally.
That tends to mean, if we really look at European history of the last 3,000 years, that we can say for approximately 300 years of the 3,000, there was democracy. That makes, in Athens, of course, and recent, that makes democracy the wild exception and not the rule.
Yeah.
So part of our problem is that we seem to believe in an identity based on democracy, on reason, on deliberation, on equality of rationality, which, if you take the historical record just a little bit seriously, you would have to admit is extremely fragile. Admitting that these values and their institutions are extremely fragile, it means that identity is very fragile. Loss of identity may be a human tragedy, but trying to stop it causes political and economic havoc. Mm-hmm. Thus, you can say we want identity in the form of an enclosed social arrangement to ourselves, but it is not an economically realistic position. And one of the problems that Finkelroth has is that he understands a social, psychological, intellectual problem, but he doesn't want to face, if you wish, the tragic element of his problem. Because the classical thing about a tragedy is this is something that's going to happen whatever the people do. It is not there is no possible way to sustain or maintain it in the realities of economics and society as they are now progressing. Globalization is happening, and for traditional senses of identity, globalization is a tragedy. There are people who say, okay, we have a Western European identity and we should make it multicultural and we should make it have very different values and beliefs and open itself to religious and cultural and emotional and artistic tendencies from all over the world. And I would have to admit my real answer is no. Democracy and its culture and its society is highly fragile, is very exceptional, has only existed in our immediate surroundings for, Robert will argue, 100 years, I'm willing to give it 150, but for a limited, very limited and short period of time. And at the point at which we move strongly into social and cultural relativism, what we're really saying is democracy is not worth defending. You can have a hope that in a little world which is as big as you can walk, you can know the other people, and you can understand what motivates them, what their issues are, that you can deal with something which is at least to some significant degree knowable. Mm-hmm. A globalized society does not have that characteristic. It's an unknowable. There are always jokes made about the fact that Kant only say that one little city and didn't travel. Mm-hmm. But I think those jokes are in a way unjust, because I think what people don't understand is that Kant is thinking about a world which can be understood. Mm-hmm. And a world that can be understood is a world that it can be experienced. It's a world with, if you wish, phenomenal engagement. Mm-hmm. It's not an accident that Dutch social scientists in the 50s and 60s of the previous century did phenomenology. Mm-hmm. Because that was still a Holland which was walkable, or actually bicycleable, and which actually could be intimately, phenomenally understood. But we've lost that scale, we've lost that possibility. Thus, when you assert reason as a universal in a globalized world, you're being very pretentious and arrogant. And you're claiming that you can understand Finland, Saudi Arabia, the strange prime minister we have in this country who seems to have troubles with his temper every once in a while. You can understand this and that and the other thing all over the place and understand how they're related to each other. And this is, of course, totally unrealistic. You're bombarded with little bits of insight and impression from all sorts of places, and they don't all come together. And to stay in this particular metaphor, they're fundamentally not walkable. Mm-hmm. And the humanist ideal, in that sense, survives in a walkable world. And if we're in an unwalkable world, that humanist ideal immediately is endangered of becoming an ideology, of becoming an assertion of a truth outside of all relationship with human beings. And then you get, of course, a humanism with no humans. And the whole project is in deep trouble.